Good morning, everyone that's joining. Still got a few more people coming in here.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. All right, we got a couple more. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right. So Dawn is sequestered with the Episcopacy, however you pronounce that word's meetings and interviews. And Kevin is with us, but he's not feeling the best. So I'm going to just be kind of the background person for help and monitor chat and anything. So you all can reach out to me if you need something during this time. But I'm going to open us up with a quick prayer and then Gil's off and running. How does that sound? So let's go to an attitude of prayer. Oh God, we take this moment and time to study you in ways in which helps us to do our ministries, to further your word and make disciples for you. So let your Holy Spirit be here as this discussion continues and Gil leads us. We give thanks for Gil and his leadership and his expertise and his ability to share it with us. And we give thanks for all that have come together here to learn more about you and to learn how we can minister in new and effective ways. So let your Holy Spirit descend upon each of us and open up our eyes, our ears, our souls, and our ways of doing things. Open those up in ways that will amaze us. It is in your Son's name we offer this prayer. Amen. All right, Gil, you're on.
Okay. Well, friends, good morning. Good to be with you again. We are now on the third out of 4 of these sessions about the book Quietly Courageous. And from my perspective, it feels a little bit more relaxed. We're already somewhere into the conversation in terms of sharing some content. Last time, I think I was kind of scrambling to get in and get caught up to you and your group. But here we are in the third time, and we still have a little bit of room here for some conversation. So the topic for today is that part of the book that had to do with temptations. But where I'd like to start is just a rehash of where we are in the conversation itself. And so I'm going to rehearse a couple of things that came from the last 2 sessions. And if you have any questions or if you have any issues that you've been thinking about or wrestling with, get them into the chat right away up front here, and we'll pause and see if there's anything that would be helpful to talk about before we just jump into something new. But we've started at the beginning talking about stuff, and I'll walk through that. But where we're going to go is the rest of today will be about temptations. And then next week, we're going to talk about the so what factor. Talking about the change of the mindset and where does it go. And I just want to point out that the book was written about 3 years ago, published about 2.5 years. I've been making this argument that we are living in a liquid culture. And a lot of stuff has already changed since that last chapter was written or the last section was written. And so where I'm hoping to go next week is beyond that last section. There's a number of things that have been significant in terms of where we've been and the implications for us as religious institutions, as congregations that live in this change culture. So, where we are is kind of halfway through, and then we'll go from there. So let me shift over to share my screen and we'll start working on some of this. There we go. Okay. All right. I'm still trying to adjust my screen to get it into the right spot here. Okay. Where are we in this conversation? what I've been arguing is that the established institutional church cannot now thrive on good leadership it currently has. And I've been trying to make it clear as I've talked with groups that this is not a critique of the good leadership that is going on. People have been working long and hard and creatively on what we can understand. The dilemma is that when you live in the moment, it's hard to understand the larger perspective around it. To live in the present moment of history is not to have the same understanding of history that you can get 10, 20, and 100 years later. And so we're working in the moment. And during the time that I have been working as ordained clergy, we have learned a lot. We've gone through all of the efforts to understand church growth, to understand congregational redevelopment, planning, congregational vitality. That has all been exceptional and really good work. It did not, however, make the difference that we were wanting. It didn't get the church reconnected to the culture. It didn't give the church back a voice that had been lost. And so to a certain extent, there has been frustration and demoralization in our church. You know, it's a hard path to work as hard as you can and to do as much as you can and to open yourself up both in mind, body, and spirit, and then not to get the results that you may have been wanting from the very beginning. And so I've made the argument that we are not the product of things gone wrong, of people who have done wrong things or inappropriate things by any means, but rather of a world grown different. And it's understanding that difference that I think is a way ahead for all of us. And so in the book, I've made that argument about our culture having moved from convergent to divergent. The convergent time was most highly experienced in the 1950s, following in the post World War II. And we have moved into an individualism, into a divergent world in which everyone wants to be different rather than think about how we're all in this together. And so when we've talked in this book study and as I've written in the book, you know, we have shifted from a social compact or a social contract, which is a giving, getting relational compact in which I understand that if I want something, I have to first give something, whether it's to my family or to my work or to my community. If I want to receive the benefits of living in a healthy family, a healthy church, a healthy community, I have to give as well as get. That's a very convergent idea. We've shifted to the moral pole star that Heckler talks about in terms of people now have a social contract that tells them that they are free to do whatever they want and to have whatever they can get up to the point that it interferes with other individuals to do the same. Now, these social contracts are terribly important. These are the agreements we make with one another in terms of how we will live together. How will we be with one another? I go back to Walter Brueggemann's, notion that every time that Israel was in a crisis, whether it was the Exodus, the exile, whether it was with the prophets, and there was some concern about Israel's relationship with God, the two questions that always came back time after time after time were, how will we now be with God and how will we now be with one another? Well, that question of how we will now be with one another is this social contract. And one of the things that's very clear is that we are now in the process of a shifting social contract once again. This moral pole star of the individual seems to be outliving itself. It no longer has the gravity that it once did. And people are now beginning to question it again. But we're still at this point where we have shifted from a communitarian culture to an individualistic culture. The convergent time was in the 1950s at the very strongest. The church was at the center. The church was an institution that benefited from being in a convergent culture. because like all mediating institutions, and as the theology of the church continues to be authentic to people, it has a lot to say about living together, about what is healthy, about what is responsibility. The church, has this voice that talks more about what is the responsibility of the faith, rather than focus only on what are the freedoms of governance. And so the church lives more comfortably at the center of a convergent time. By the time we hit the 21st century, we're in a very divergent, individualistic time. And all of our institutions have suffered as collateral damage to this shift in the social contract. And congregations very much at the same. We do not have the same place in the culture or the same voice in the culture. And it isn't because we have done something wrong. And it isn't because people have suddenly become secular. It's that the values around us have shifted, and we have to learn how to live in this new place. And so I've been making this argument that rather than work harder, I go back to the quote from Alpesh Bhatt that we talked about before. We don't need to work harder. We don't need to be more creative of how to improve ourselves. What we need is a new mindset, a new way of thinking about it. And so we walked a little bit into that issue about the difference between conditions and problems. That you and I are trained as problem solvers, that we look for something that is a problem so that we can figure out how to fix it. But the reality is that if in fact we are a product of a changed time, that changed time is not a problem because it has no solution. We can't fix that. It's not a problem, it's a condition that we have to learn to live with. And I know we talked briefly about this, but one of the things that Ron Heifetz points out from his work at Harvard is really that when you're faced with a problem, that what you do is you move to action, you fix it. But when you're in a condition, if you act too soon, you will make the situation worse. Instead of acting, what you have to do is you have to learn how to live. Instead of moving to action, you move to learning. One of the things that Heifetz will talk about is that leaders have to learn the difference between balcony space and the dance floor. He uses that kind of an image or a metaphor of a dance floor. And it's on the dance floor where all the action happens. That's where leaders, go day after day after day to do things. And in fact, that's one of the things that you and I have to attend to. We really do have to be on the dance floor consistently. To care for whatever the issues are that people are bringing or whatever the needs are for our church. We have to be there and we have to be involved and we have to provide that kind of, managerial oversight. But Heifetz makes the observation that the dance floor is the least thoughtful place that leaders do their work. In other words, when you're in the midst of action, it's really hard to think broader and bigger about what's going on. And so you get caught up in problem solving, even when you're not faced with problems. What Heifetz says is that leaders have to learn how to get on the balcony. They have to step off of the dance floor, out of the action every once in a while, get up on the balcony and get the bigger perspective. Take an overview, take the time and the opportunity to ask ourselves, what's going on here? How do I understand what the bigger picture is that can help direct what an appropriate way forward ahead is? In fact, these book studies that your resourcing office at the conference is offering are examples of balcony space. How do you step out of your work, clergy and lay? How do you step away from your direct responsibilities, back up enough to take a different look at it so that you can ask yourself, what is the right way ahead? How can we helpfully think about and move on these things? That issue of balcony is critical. It's one of the things that that helps us to understand that part of the work that we do is discernment on behalf of others, learning on behalf of others. This is one of the reasons why we have to continually care for and attend to our own spiritual nurture, because moving toward our spirit helps us to get off the dance floor and into the bigger perspective. It helps us to take a look at our situation, not just from the immediacy of whatever the institution needs, but from the mindfulness and the purposefulness of God. And to ask ourselves again, is this a way ahead? And I've been making the argument that this is even more important when we are in the midst of deep change in a liquid culture, when everything is changing so fast that whatever we determined before we can implement it, things have changed again. Without that larger purview, without that new mindset, it is really difficult to know how to go ahead. And in fact, what we do is we simply exhaust ourselves on the dance floor. So last week, we began to talk about assumptions as a barrier to that mindset. You can't simply kind of decide that you're going to shift everything. You have to deal with yourself first, because we are controlled, we are directed by the assumptions that we hold. One of the things that psychology has taught us for quite some time is that our behavior, even though we can think of it as being freely chosen, is much more directed by both the values that we hold and the assumptions that we hold. And the values that we hold and the assumptions that we hold are not easily available to us in a conscious level. And so what I've been talking about up to this point is that we really do need to think through how we understand the way the change itself happens. We need to rethink what we feel about resources and how we use them. We need to challenge our assumptions now about organizations and democracy. For a quick example is, Roger's rule of order. That kind of practice of democracy that we have, that there are rules of engagement. In a convergent culture, Robert's rules of order make perfect sense, because in a convergent culture where people have a communitarian kind of a mindset, whenever the people with those values get together, they are always seeking toward moving toward an agreeable middle. They are automatically kind of prejudiced toward some kind of agreement. And so Robert's Rules of Order is a way in which we can get a group to agreement as quickly as possible. But that's because the culture and the group is already oriented toward that convergence. When you use Robert's Rules of Order in a divergent culture, in a divergent organization, in which people are not focused on moving toward the mean, but moving toward their differences, Robert's Rules of Order is not a shortcut to agreement. It becomes the rules of the battleground by which we will defeat each other. And so we have to look at the way in which we use our tools and the way we assume our organizations work. The last couple of general conferences that we have misapplied the Robert's Rules of Order to an organization that we want to move toward agreement, but that in fact is stuck in a culture of debate and contest over our differences. We need to walk deeper into that. And the last one that has to do with how leadership is formed. And we're not going to go into that, but I do deeply encourage you to kind of take a look at that and to test your own assumptions on that. So that's where we've been in this conversation so far. So let's stop for a moment. And David, I don't know, are there any questions that we have that people want to surface?
None that has shown up. Either raise your hand if you want to say something, or throw it in the chat real quick.
Or just move or wave to know that you're awake and that we're all in this together. And so.
Okay, so Lloyd does have one. Go ahead, Lloyd. You can unmute yourself.
Just a comment, and it deals with both all three sessions. You mentioned the idea about the difference between institution and individual, this shift that we're kind of seeing. I was born in '64, so I was at the tail end of the baby boom generation.
Right.
I have lived with this dichotomy my entire ministry, because everybody that I minister with older is very much still in that mindset of institutionalism, and my children and all those that I'm baptizing are in a very different place in terms of how they view church and discipleship, where those before see merely coming and participating in the activities of the institution.
Whoop, we lost you, Lloyd. You went
Sorry.
mute.
So that those who were before in what you call the divergent culture see discipleship merely as participating in institutional activities, where younger generations are seeing discipleship and evangelism and mercy expressed individually. I came into the Methodist Church for that very reason, because John Wesley pulled those things together.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of our folks, I'm not sure, understand our theology, or maybe we wouldn't be having this painful discussion.
No, I think that's true. Yeah, okay, so I agree with you. And, you know, a lot of us here on this Zoom, you know, either were born into or were formed in that time when that shift began to happen. Lloyd, I don't know if there was a specific question you had in there. You know, what I heard was your observation about where we are.
No, I wanted to say that I think this is a very useful conversation, a very helpful, as you just said, balcony view conversation.
Right.
Because a lot of the people I talk with, colleagues, lay people, and a lot of the stuff that's out there for like helpful literature isn't discussing this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. But let's just walk a step or two into that each of us, you know, have been born into this shift in this value system at some point. Lloyd, you were born at the tail end of the baby boomers. I was born at the very beginning of the baby boomers. The baby boomers is not, you know, one generational cohort. It in fact goes longer than that. And you'll often find in the literature the baby boomers are divided into the early and the late boomers. That's a common kind of orientation. One of the things that suggests is that the early baby boomers tend to align more with the earlier giving-getting social contract. And the later baby boomers are much more open to the individual moral pole star. One of the things about that is that wherever you are, each of us is working out of a preference. We can understand the shift. But even though we understand the shift, we still have a preference. I got to tell you how much my preference is with the giving-getting compact. That's the family I came from. That's the church I was born into. That's the culture I lived with. I get consumerism. I get individualism. I understand it. There's a whole lot of stuff I like about it, but I still have my own preference. Now, if we can say that about ourselves, we also need to say that about our institutions. And one of the things about institutions is that they are not designed to lead cultural change. They are lagging indicators. They follow social change. And so one of the things that we've struggled with in a lot of our congregations is that even though we're eager to help our congregations live in a changed culture, they still have preferences for the way they've always done things. They still have preferences to want to take everything to the governing board to make sure that everybody's in agreement. They don't want to move ahead if one person is not, you know, happy about moving ahead. It isn't that long ago that I was involved with a little effort here in my own congregation to move ahead in an area in which there was a kind of a subcommittee that was set aside to do some planning. And we met 3 or 4 times. And then we figured out how we were going to move ahead, and we took our report. Do you hear that? Our report. and we sent it over to the governing board. Well, the governing board then sat down and redid all of the work of the committee and said, well, I see where they're going, but wouldn't it be better if it did this? And how about if we involve those? And I'm not sure. Okay. That is a preference to a very convergent time in which the governing board sees itself as the center of all agreement, and their responsibility is to make sure that it will only move ahead if there is full agreement, instead of allowing the congregation to move ahead in its various component parts. Even though we have some people who want to move ahead and to move ahead only with those folk who have the same passion around a particular item, the old mode and the preferences of the church want to take us back. Now, clergy and key lay people often get caught in that as if it's a contest. And people have lost their ministry on those kinds of issues. The issue here for me is that one of the key responsibilities of leadership is to get other folk up on the balcony with you to see the larger issues about why it's important to move ahead. Congregations cannot keep electing the same leaders that they've had for 30 years and assume that those leaders are going to come to their task with a fresh mind. So you have a couple of options. You have to begin to open up the porous boundaries of leadership and begin to invite new people in and change the conversation, or you've got to get current leaders up on the balcony with you to say, there is a reason for us to think about ourselves institutionally in a very different way, because we're in a different time doing different work. The one thing that is not helpful is simply to say as a leader, well, you know, I'd love to go ahead if only the people would get out of my way. Or I'd love to go ahead if only the people would stop doing things, you know, the way they've always done it. No, in fact, you know, the whole responsibility of leadership is to help people, not just in their organizational life, but in their spiritual life, to say, is not God doing a new thing? And how do we follow God into this wilderness instead of wanting to go back to Egypt all the time? This is part of who we are. By going up on the balcony ourselves, we go up there not to show how bad everybody else in the way they're doing, but to figure out how are we going to get other people in this conversation as well. Anything else before we move ahead?
Brahm had put a question in the chat, Gil. She says, I'm an early boomer, but grew up in a community that valued innovation and individualism. My schooling was very much structured around individualized learning. Can institutions that do change become the impetus for change into the new way of living and see change agents in other institutions?
Oh, sure, sure. But okay, let's see if we can do this relatively quickly. There is a difference in all of our institutions in terms of working from the center or working from the edge. And if you think, let's just talk very quickly about a congregation. If you think of it as three concentric rings that are inside of each other. The ring inside, the smallest ring at the center is the leadership. This is the clergy and your board and the people who are most active, either formal or informal, make all the decisions. And they have the highest investment in the way that the congregation already exists. Around that is a ring we can call membership. These are the people who are, you know, connected to the congregation in a very deep way, and they attend a lot of stuff, but they're not going to make a lot of decisions because they're happy with the way things are going on, and they get involved for the most part. And then the larger circle around that are the participants. And the participants are the people who see themselves as a part of you and a part of what you're doing, but they're not going to get involved with the stuff at the center and make decisions you know, and worry about how things are going to go. They're going to come in and out as it meets their needs, both personal, family, and spiritual. How we doing? Make sense so far? The closer you are to the center, the harder it is to change the institution. Think about it in terms of our bishops. Our bishops run for election. You know, one of the things that I know about bishops is that they run for election because in their mind, they keep saying, if only I could move to the center, I'd be able to bring something new and fresh to this organization. I'd be able to help sort things out. I've got ideas. I know where we can go. What they don't realize is that as soon as they get elected to the center, they no longer have the freedom of all those ideas because now they're responsible for the institution as is. They're responsible for the book of discipline, for all the rules, for all the order, and anybody can stop them if they don't obey their own rules. It's hard to change from the center. Where our institutions change the easiest is from the outer ring, from the edge, for the people who are willing to move to the edge. Because the edge is the place that has the most freedom from the way we've always done things. In fact, a lot of the work I've done with bishops and district superintendents over the time is to say, what does it mean for you to lead with 1 foot in the center and 1 foot on the edge? So that you understand the rules and everything, but you are not immeasurably bound by them. One of the things I've worked with bishops on is how to read the book of discipline. You know, if you want to stand on the edge, the way you read the book of discipline is that in every single section, you read the statement of purpose that is at the beginning of the section. And then you stop reading. Because everything after that is all the rules and regulations that are going to stop you from everything. If you can live in the center and keep in mind what the purpose is, and then ask, how do we now live out this purpose in this condition, in this situation, under these circumstances, then a lot of stuff opens up. And so, long way around the barn, but Ron, yes, I mean, some of us were nurtured in institutions that didn't have such a bounded center, and themselves were moving toward the edge of their purpose. And those of us in the church, some of us are serving congregations that live much more at the edge of our denomination than they do at the center. And many of us are much more comfortable living out on the edge, where the purpose is clear, but we feel bounded by you know, all the rules and regulations. And so part of what we're negotiating now as a denomination is how strong are the rules at the center going to be? How much agreement do we have to have, both in terms of our theology and our practice? This is open, malleable territory, friends. But the reality is a lot of us are in congregations. A lot of you are members of or serving congregations that have very, very solid centers that are not terribly porous, and they need some help to see a bigger picture, a different picture. How are we doing? Is this making sense? All right. Well, let me, John, I see you raising your hand. Do you want to jump in, and then we're going to move ahead? Well, you're muted.
Gil, this is Sandy Stovall. May I speak at this point?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I am struggling. I'm excited about what you have to offer us. I see the necessity for the transformation of the church. I understand the shifts, but what I struggle with is working with the end in mind, and I don't know what the end is. And I'm kind of a Stephen Covey person that starts with the end in mind in most of my efforts. But in this particular situation, I don't have an idea of what the church will be. So to set that goal, to lead people or to join with people to create the new church, I don't know what the end in mind is.
No, thank you. That was really well said, very well said. And that is the anxiety that I think we have to live with. Let me just go back to the very basis, because this is at the heart of all that we're doing here, Sandy. The name of the book is Quietly Courageous, because what you're talking about is the need to have courage. How do you lead when you cannot be sure where you're going?
Mhm.
This is the Moses moment. You've got to take the people into the wilderness. You don't have a map. All you have is a promise. Now, that's a really difficult thing for leaders to do, because leaders get rewarded only if they have answers. And so we have to deal with ourselves. In a liquid culture, there is no end game here. There is no end sight. I applaud your thinking, in terms of start with the end of mind. And Covey is 100% right if you are in a stable moment when the end can be named. But at other times, what you have to learn is what is the direction that you believe is healthy, morally right, and faithful, and head out in that direction, knowing you're going to have to change your path as you learn more.
Okay.
Did I tell you guys all the story about the mother who sent the son out on a dark night with a flashlight, and you just walk to the end of the light? That's the moment we're in right now.
Mhm.
We have to have a conviction that the congregation, that the church has a place in this culture, that we have something worthy to say, that there is a way of engaging the culture, and we have to learn enough to take a first step so that it will teach us more. I'm sorry, I can't remember, man, my age, I can't remember a lot of things, but I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a book, I think it's called the Not for Not Profit book. The reason I'm pointing to that is here's a guy who really wanted to make a difference. I think he was in Minneapolis or St. Paul, in helping to help people in poverty get employed so that they could deal with their own issues and everything like that. Well, the marvel of the book is that he thought he had an end game in mind, but every time he took a step, he learned more about the conditions that he was working with and the people he was working with. And the book is about how he shaped and reshaped and shaped again what he had to do in order to get to his original goal. If you're looking for a great read, not a page turner, but if you're looking for a great read that can help us in times like this, that's the kind of thinking that we need to be able to follow. And that's why this is kind of dangerous and difficult time, demanding courage. Well, John, last one, and then we're going to move ahead quickly.
I apologize. I didn't realize I was muted. It might be helpful, sir, if you could spend, not today, maybe next session, spend some time talking about effective ways to deal with conflict in a liquid environment. Those of us that have been around a while, we were taught conflict management, which works in a convergent environment, but I don't think is going to do any good in a divergent environment. So if you've pondered that thought and have useful tools for us to consider, I think that might be helpful given what we're learning.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John. There really is a connection here, and much more than we have time for either this week or next week involved. I will say that, one of the things I want you to think about when you're going through the chapter on change, our assumptions about change, is that the very same drivers that drive conflict are the drivers that drive change. The difference is when you're working with change, you're working with those drivers pre-fight. When you're doing conflict, you're working with those drivers post-fight. But they're still the very same dynamics. And so in the model that I offer of nonlinear change, in that chapter on change, one of the things that I talk about is that the leader has to help people look at very realistically both the pain and the possibility, then get out of the box. And if you can work through those issues, you will lead people into chaos. Well, Chaos is that conflict. It is that change. It is those dynamics where everything suddenly becomes ripe and unshaped and malleable, where things can happen for which you as a leader will not be rewarded. As a matter of fact, you'll get negative rewards for that. But that's where the Spirit of God moves. The biblical word has been telling us that. The new sciences have been telling us that. Our own culture is now telling us that. We have to learn how to lead in a wilderness without knowing the next, exactly where we're going. We need to have an orientation, a purpose, and then we need to have the courage to take the next steps. Okay, so
Gil.
now, how's that for an introduction that took us 40 minutes? Yeah, David.
Just Julia Singleton has a really interesting question in the chat. It's essentially saying, how do you, sorry about that, how do you, when you grow up in a divergent leadership model, how do you lead a convergent minded church? So a millennial growing up in a divergent model, but now leading a convergent minded church, how do you do that?
Sure. And that really is the tension we've been talking about. If our institutions come out of that deep convergent time and they continue to hold those values, then how do we help them negotiate with, with the change culture? A lot of our larger congregations have already learned how to do that. That's one of the reasons they're large. They are now culturally comfortable in this time. And it's worth taking a look at how they've done a number of these things. And one of the things that you can do is to help your congregation learn not so much how to get large, but what are the shifts that our larger congregations have done in order to be more culturally connected. And friends, a lot of that has to do with breaking out of the very tight leadership circle that kept constraints on the way that the congregation happened, making our leadership more porous, our membership and participation more porous, our programming more diverse and inclusive of people. How do we help get people out of, well, we're going to go into this a little bit more, as we jump into these other things, and maybe I can make more comments there. But yes, this is the very reason why we're having this tension, that we do have congregations that were built on and are clinging to an earlier time in a moment when we're already getting past, the peak of the new change. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the shifts that we're seeing coming in the future as well. So, Julia, I know there's no clear answer there, but you've got your question in the right place. So let's keep moving ahead. And what I'm going to do is jump back into the PowerPoint and share a little bit more, and then that might add to the conversation for next week. So let's see if we can go there. Okay. Get rid of that. All right. So where we have been so far is looking at the assumptions that we carry as the barrier to this new mindset. And what I want to say is we're going to move on to the temptations. And the temptations operate somewhat differently within us. The assumptions that we looked at before, about the way we assume change happens and the way we think about resources and everything. They control us quite often because they are hidden from our eyes. We have to be very intentional about testing ourselves about what we assume or think at a given time in order to move forward. Temptations operate not because they're hidden, but because they're rewarded. The definition of a temptation is a desire to do something, especially something wrong or unwise. And so I have this little thing that I said there, introducing the temptations, that they are most delicious because they feel as if they're quickly rewarded. However, the rewards eventually do us in, reducing us to a skeleton because we've actually been feasting off of ourselves, our own purpose, our own hope, our own future. The temptations that we face are those that go against what we actually are trying to do, because they give us an immediate satisfaction. This is the thing that we talked about before, the distinction between leadership and management. Our congregations will always ask us for leadership, help us to change, help us to do something new, help us to get better at something. But then they will only reward us for management, for making things the same, for doing the things that we have always done before. And so in the book, I talk about 3 different temptations: nostalgia, Christian empathy, and tiredness. And each of these, is worth 4 weeks by themselves, because these are deep, deep controls in our own lives and certainly in our leadership. But with our time, let's just jump in at least to nostalgia. One of the things I talk about in nostalgia is that it gets rewarded in 3 different ways. Using Mark Lilla's work on the revolutionary mind, he points out that nostalgia invites us into a one-sided story. Now, his argument is that in any given situation, there are always 2 stories. One is the reactionary story, and one is the revolutionary story. And in some sense, all of our organizations, and in a moment, in this particular moment, as well as our national conversation, is a contest between these 2 narratives, between the reactionary narrative and the revolutionary narrative. The story that's going to take us back, and the reason it wants to take us back is because there is known stuff there that we know how to deal with. And it's more assured. We have some sense that we'll at least be in some control if we go back into nostalgia, as opposed to the revolutionary story that can only offer us some idea or picture of how it could be, but no real concrete evidence about how it's going to happen or what it's going to take. And so there's risks on both sides. If you go into the reactionary story, you're going back to something that you know how it works, but it might not really be the solution. But if you go ahead into the revolutionary story, one of the things that Lilla points out is that you're going into something that may well fail. Do you want to risk that? Well, the reason we go back into nostalgia so much is because we get rewarded for taking people back, because that's where the comfort is. That's where their feelings of strength are. I have this thing here in the slide about the pictures in the back of the sanctuary. In the thousands of congregations that I've been in, there is a subset of congregations that have pictures on the back wall of their sanctuary that show the men's Bible class from the 1940s or the 1930s or the 1920s, and the women's Bible classes from that same period of time. And the sanctuary is filled. Not only are the pews filled, but all along the wall, people are standing 1 and 2 deep. And they all have black clothing on, black suits or black dresses and white collars, and they all look the same. And they're always very, very, very somber as they're having the picture taken. And those pictures are hanging there to remind those people where they come from and where they would like to go back to. Nostalgia is very comforting. And so people are going to ask you, when this pandemic is over, how are we going to go back into the sanctuary and get everybody back in and then get more people beside? And all the evidence that we have is that that reactionary narrative is not going to happen. That when we reopen our sanctuaries, everybody is not going to come back, no matter how much we want it. But the fact is that in those conversations, if you start planning with people about how we're going to go back and how we're going to be the same and how we're going to get stronger back there, you will be rewarded for the work. If you start the conversation that says, yeah, we're going to open up our sanctuary and we're going to invite everybody back, but we're also going to have to take these other steps to stay connected with people who are in a different place, who are now kind of connecting with us, you will not be rewarded for wanting to take those extra steps. My wife and I belong to a local church here, and we continue to participate weekly with them. But one of the other churches that we also participate in at distance, more so now than ever before because of the pandemic, is Christ Church Manhattan in New York City. In this last week, in the pandemic, using Zoom, they received new members. I'm going to say that maybe there was a dozen new members or 15 new members, whatever it was. And the new members came from Kansas City. They came from New York City, obviously, as well, but they also came from Kansas City, someplace in Washington State, and also from Brazil. Now, going back and to say that all of the ministry we're going to do is in the congregation is not actually a way ahead in this culture. It is the reactionary story, a one-sided story, without acknowledging that there can be a different story. And so we get rewarded for that. Nostalgia invites us to rely on past diagnoses. This is another kind of a close link to the same thing about the stories. But it allows us to think that we already understand what's going on. Yuval Levin has a really remarkable book called The Fractured Republic. And this is not talking about the church in any way. It's really talking about us as an American people. And one of the things that he points out there is that at the moment, we have been stuck in an argument between the Democrats and the Republicans. And now this goes, kind of earlier apart from what's been happening through our current crises. But if you think about the kinds of campaigns that these two groups run, they are all nostalgic campaigns. He points out that the Democrats continue to reach back to the 1960s and the Great Society, in which the government takes on the responsibility of the common good to make sure that everybody is cared for. And one of the things the Democratic picture would like us to recapture is a way in which the government can step in and play that role for everyone. Well, meantime, the Republicans are really anchored in the 1980s, not the 1960s, and they're anchored in a Reaganism that really honors the free market and wants the free market to help individuals prosper, so that as the rewards of prospering trickle down through the system, the people who have the greatest need will be met naturally by the free hand and the I forget what Adam Smith used to call it from the very beginning, the silent hand of the culture and so forth, of the economy, and that kind of need will take care of itself. What Levin points to is that if we go back to the 60s or the 80s, we will argue about how to go back to something that no longer exists in a post-Cold War world, instead of talking about how do we move ahead. But same thing applies. You get rewarded for thinking back and moving backwards. Nostalgia allows us to avoid difficult questions. It allows us to do the easier work. Actually, if you help your congregation try to go back to where it was, you are avoiding all of the work that Sandy was talking about of having to move ahead without knowing where you're going. You get rewarded by taking on the easier work, even though you know it's not going to help in the long run. So there are rewards that we have to be really aware of and comfortable here. I talk about it with empathy, that empathy is in fact a Christian, an issue of Christian character, to be able to observe and to bear the pain of others. But overused, it allows the pain in the system to stop us from changing. If we get overly empathetic, Ed Friedman has said social regression has too often perverted the use of empathy into a disguise for anxiety, a rationalization for the failure to define a position, and a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. Well, in other words, if people can come to their leaders, clergy or lay, and say, if you move ahead, you are causing me great pain because you're not honoring, well, you know, the location of the baptismal fount where my grandfather was baptized, or you're not honoring, you know, the leadership that my parents gave or I've been giving, or you're not honoring this group that has been so instrumental to my life. You know, I've been involved with annual conferences where clergy will stand up and say, we have to increase the funding for our camps because that's where I met my wife. And if you allow the camps to suffer, you are stomping on my memories of my own love for my spouse. If we continue to entertain those kinds of conversations, we are allowing people to use their pain to stop the change that is purposeful and faithful for the mission of the church. We can overuse empathy. In fact, you know, one of the other books that I would point out as you go along here is Christopher Bealey's book on something about leadership for a new time. Again, I'm a man of my age and I have to plead here. But the whole issue about what were the teachings of the early church fathers. Bealey is a historian, a church historian, and one of the things that he will talk about is that the early church fathers, we're talking now about the dominant people in the first through the 5th century of the church. They had a notion of the cure of souls. Now, the cure of souls is today what we would call pastoral care. And today, when we're doing pastoral care, more often than not, what we focus on is empathy, how to stand with people and help them in their pain. But the early church fathers, according to Bealey, saw the cure of souls in a very different way. They would teach that if someone needed care and compassion, then what they should be given is care and compassion. But if someone needed a challenge to move ahead in their life or with their spirit, then what the pastor was to give was a challenge. If someone needed to be called to responsibility for what they were doing, then the appropriate pastoral care would be a call to responsibility. If someone needed to be rebuked for what they had done, then the appropriate pastoral response would be rebuke. In other words, it wasn't just located in empathy as if that is the only exercise that we have in our emotional and spiritual relationship with one another. If we overuse our empathy, we allow ourselves and we allow people around us to shut down that which takes quiet courage. Now, we could go on, and I'm going to jump out of here, stopping the share. We could go on again to talk about tiredness. I think this is one of the other issues that is really fundamental to the lives of a lot of leaders. We are sustaining ourselves by exhausting ourselves, because if you don't know where you're going, you can at least have the satisfaction for being exhausted by trying. And you get rewarded for that. There are some other issues that are noted in surplus powerlessness that you'll find in the writing that I've done there, which I think we have to pay close attention to. But you and I also have lives beyond this book study, and we're coming up to the noon hour, and so we're going to stop there. And so next week when we get together, we'll pick up on this again. I'll probably try to make a little bit of room for questions that we have. But then I do want to go on and talk about that so what issue. If you're reading, to kind of align with what we're talking about, I'm going to encourage you to finish up the book and take a look at that last section. What I have in there, I still stand by. I have no question about that. I do think that these are the places that I continue to give a lot of my attention. But I hope next week we can talk a little bit more about how the world has changed even further from what we've described so far. In a liquid culture that is changing faster than we can learn how to implement our responses, we have to stay up with the changes. And I do think that we are shifting again. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that we're shifting back to is much more of a relational social contract. At least people are now beginning to think about it in a new way. And I'd like to address that. So we are now right up at the 12 o'clock hour. The world calls us to bigger and better things. I don't know. Is there anything else that needs to be said before we say goodbye? David, are we okay? We okay just to...
I think so. There's no comments, no other questions. And I don't know how you guys normally end this.
Oh, well, we just turn each other off.
Okay, so there you go. Although there has been a message asking if they can continue the discussion with you, that 4 weeks isn't enough. So we'll get that message to Kevin and let Kevin kind of work through that detail.
Since Dawn's not on as CD chair, I'll just jump in there. And thank Gil for speaking again today. We have had the 4 weeks planned, and we do have other things that are coming up after that. So unfortunately, we won't be able to continue, but hopefully everybody is getting things out of this and enjoying it. And Kevin will have, though, a chat piece up that you can respond to and have some more conversations with each other about these notes. So you'll be able to respond to that. We've been doing that each week. So at this point, thank you all for coming. And
Can we end with prayer, please?
yes, we can. Dave, would you want to do that?
You can do it, Lloyd.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for everything that Gil has been prodding us to think about. We thank you for all of the different people he has brought to our attention that we can also read. We thank you for the discussion and for the time put into this. And we pray that in these coming days, we might be faithful to you and see ways to be your church in this new and different kind of time. We pray these things in Christ's name, who is unchanging. Amen. Thank you, folks. Dave, you can go ahead and close
Take
it
care.
off.
I'll end the meeting. All right, bye-bye, everybody. I don't know if I can do that. Kevin, can I end this meeting?